Well, hi everyone, Ron Vaillant here. Hope you're doing well. Recently, I'd watched a live stream that Derek Smith had done. He's with the Unacceptable Fringe, and that was the APP rally. I believe it was in Red Deer, and some things were said there that I want to be able to comment about because they're quite alarming. And it's important that if we're going to go ahead and move towards Alberta independence, that we end up not having continuous problems that we've had in the past, right? So now it's Jeff Rath who's speaking. Now I don't know Jeff. I've never met him, and I've no acquaintance whatsoever. But he is definitely a key principle of the Alberta Prosperity Project, as you may know, along with Dennis Moudry. So I want to be able to go and look at some of these clips and talk about it, and we might as well just get right into it, and we'll just make some comments as we go. So just short little segments here, and then I'll make my comments.
But anyway, well, they've been busy doing that. I've been working at home with other APP volunteers and CEOs of financial institutions and people with more letters after their names than they have in them, working on a fully costed business plan for an independent Alberta. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the numbers are staggering. On the first run through, I asked the economist that was doing the first run through on the numbers, and I said, come on, tell me, how do the numbers look? He goes, Jeff, we're going to be like Monaco. And quite seriously, I mean, what we're looking at, and this is after taking into account all of the federal services that we're going to replace. So $1.5 billion startup cost, for a training cadre and an Alberta Armed Forces, 3% of GDP thereafter for an Alberta Armed Forces. I'll talk more in more detail about our sovereign Indigenous people in a minute, but tripling the amount of funding to Indigenous people in Alberta to finally alleviate Indigenous poverty in this province, through constitutionalized resource revenue sharing and other mechanisms that I know, I met with the chief and council today, that First Nations in Alberta are going to love. So that's fully costed in.
Okay, so here Jeff Rath is discussing different things. One is talking about a fully costed business plan, which is, highly needed if you're going to go ahead and do something like this. I mean, people need to know that going forward that all these different details are going to be looked at and dealt with and have a plan in place. So, I mean, kudos for doing that. But then he goes on talking about this Indigenous people of Alberta. And one thing you have to understand as you listen to Jeff is that he has been a lawyer for the various different Indian bands in Alberta, for the last 20 years, and has probably made a substantial amount of money working with them and for them, and has intimate contact with them as well. And so if he's going to go ahead and talk about the things that we're just going to discuss right now, is there actually any kind of a payback for him to be able to do that in future contracts or what have you? And really, I think what needs to be done is there needs to be an approximate accounting of how much money Jeff has made on account of doing work for them. And is this going to be a conflict of interest? Is it a conflict of interest now? And does Jeff really have to recuse himself, from this Indigenous aspect because of his potential gains in future work, Okay, so did you notice the first thing he said? He talked about the sovereign Indigenous people. Okay, so sovereign, I mean, that can mean different things. I mean, if you're sovereign, that means the laws of the country or of a new Alberta don't apply to you. So these people will be over and above any laws that would be created for a new Alberta if you're going to go ahead and have them classified as sovereign. Sovereign also, like King Charles, is called sovereign, is our supreme ruler over the rest of everyone else. And so right from the get-go, calling the Indigenous sovereign and creating a new Alberta Constitution with them perhaps being called sovereign is very problematic, because now you're going to have a two-tier society right off the get-go. We all have to be on the same level playing field if we're going to go ahead and do a new Alberta. So calling them sovereign is highly problematic, and I think people need to call them out on this, as well as some of these other things that are going to be said as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go read. I wrote down what he had said, so I got the exact wording, but he wants to basically, he says, tripling the amount of funding to the Indigenous people in Alberta to finally alleviate Indigenous poverty. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. He's calling them Indigenous. Indigenous is a UN globalist term that I flatly reject, and I think most people who are Native Indian do not like the term Indigenous either, because they see it with the UN globalist ties to it. And it actually, if you were to go and look at Indigenous means to be born of the land. I'm Indigenous. I've been born in Canada, as my forefathers back to the 1600s on both sides of my family. So I'm Indigenous as well. And so this UN term Indigenous is going to actually eviscerate this whole thing of what's going on. Well, it's too hard to get into right now, but anyhow, Indigenous, using the term Indigenous is highly problematic and a very UN globalist term. So he's talking about tripling the funding. Okay, so who's going to be funding this? Is it going to be the tax slaves who are going to be funding this? And tripling it, imagine that. I mean, right now as it stands, the various different Indian bands, they get airdropped all kinds of boatloads of money that we don't see otherwise. I remember in 2019, when I was in the federal election there, I was going to an event just north of Fort St. John, and I was going around a curve, and just before this huge valley, and I saw this guy on the side of the road hitchhiking, and I thought, oh man, I missed him, and then I thought, oh boy, so I was going down the valley. It's a huge, valley, and going up the other side, and it just bugged me. I need to go pick this guy up, and it's costing me a boatload driving my camper van all throughout BC, and I'm going to turn around. So I go and find a place to safely turn around and go all the way back, all the way down, all the way up. Finally, he's still there, and I find a place to turn around again. I pick the guy up, and man, he's a guy just freezing outside. We turn up the heat in the vehicle. It became a sauna in there, but the poor guy was freezing, And I forget what band he was from, but he was just talking about how everyone in the band is going to get airdropped like 70 grand, And I don't know. I've never been airdropped 70 grand from anything, like that. But yet here these people get all this money, and so. He talks about it that it's not very good because his friend, he said, he was talking to his friend and his conversation went like this, this 70 grand, what it's going to do. And his friend says, what? He says, it's going to mean your death, because he knows his friend is a drug addict and his friend's just going to go and blow it on drugs and he's probably going to overdose. And so he was concerned for his friend. And, I've heard other stories, like when I was in Fort St. John during that election, that when the Indian bands get these boatloads of money coming down on them, they'll come into town, they'll start buying stuff, and a lot of guys will buy these Ford F-150 pickup trucks, and the dealerships are all happy and everything else like that. And, a few weeks later, a month later, you start finding them wrapped around telephone poles or abandoned or what have you. I mean, easy come, easy go, right? That's how it works out. And so is it really good to be just, giving boatloads of money to these people? I mean, it's just not the way to do it. I mean, if there's some kind of resource development done on a reserve, there's no problem at all. I have no problem with that. But I mean, if it's a situation where the government is just doling out all this money willy-nilly, well, that's not very healthy to their society at all. But okay, so Jeff wants to go ahead and continue this on and triple the amount of money, to finally alleviate Indigenous poverty. Well, poverty is not because of not getting enough money from the government. That's not what brings us into poverty. Poverty is when we are not able to, develop ourselves to be able to earn money and to bring it in ourselves. So to go ahead and to give government money to alleviate the poverty is not the solution at all. It's totally the opposite thing. And from my standpoint, instead of tripling and giving just more money to their destruction, far better off would be to eliminate that money. And I would say go for an 8-year plan where every year the money is reduced, so they have an 8-year time window to be able to move sideways and to be able to develop their own situations, businesses or resources or work or training or whatever it may be, right? But anyhow, okay, so he continues on and he says he's going to do this through constitutional rebirth revenue sharing. Now, what is constitutional rebirth revenue sharing? I think Jeff needs to talk about that and let people know what that is. So obviously the Constitution of a new Alberta is going to have this element built into it to triple the amount of funding to the various different Indian bands, and not just the bands, but to the people themselves. And then he says, and other mechanisms. So I don't know what the other mechanisms are, but... And then he goes on and says, I met with the chief and council today. He's very in touch with these various different bands because he's been doing all this work for them. So I met with the chief and council today, and the First Nations are going to love this. And then, people are clapping. They don't understand what he's talking about, I don't think. Well, of course they're going to love it because he's giving them sovereignty over Alberta and Albertans and tripling the revenue and everything else. I mean, so Jeff, what are you doing? This is not the way to do things. And we'll get back to this actually, in another segment here where he's talking about another element, and you can see the total, hypocrisy in what he's talking about. You can't have it both ways, Jeff. We'll get into it a little bit later.
So everything fully costed in, external affairs, the whole 9 yards, and the fiscal capacity surplus that we're left with, it's between 30 and 50 billion dollars a year that will stay in Alberta and will stay in all of your pockets in the form of tax relief and getting completely rid of federal income tax and cutting everybody's tax bills by more than half. That's just year one. And just using really, really conservative projections as to where the Alberta economy could be in 5 years, year one, we're already being able to cut taxes by half. By year 5, it will be possible to double the pensions of every Alberta pensioner and completely eliminate income tax in the province of Alberta.
Okay, so in this section here, talking about the fully costed plan, business plan is very good. But the thing I question is, did his alphabet soup planners factor in a steep drop in the Canadian dollar, when Alberta was to vote for separation? So you go ahead and have a vote for Alberta separation. And now if that passes, we are in no man's land. This is a territory that we've never been in Canada. And there is no legal or structured way to go and work through it. And as far as the Canadian dollar, one of the elements as far as its value is the stability of the country and its ability to repay all the boatloads of money that they've borrowed. And this could actually devalue our dollar greatly by half or more. So, did these planners, who obviously are, excellent people in their field, but did they go ahead and factor in that our dollar could drop dramatically? Is that part of their business plan?
The other thing I wanted to touch on, because again, I want to get back to this idea of Canada being an existential threat to Albertans. I read this last week that the Liberals are resuscitating their universal basic income plan. So if you think about what I was saying earlier about Alberta culture and, basically, our desire to teach our children the value of hard work and industry and being able to take care of their own families and be proud, independent people, the Liberals are again floating a plan called Universal Basic Income. This plan entails giving every single person in Canada, starting at the age of 17, so listen to this, 17, every 17-year-old will be given $2,000 a month, whether they're in school, whether they have a job, whether they have a plan to go to school, whether they have a plan to get a job, everybody's going to be given $2,000 a month. Well, the dwindling number of us who still work for a living and pay real taxes, as opposed to the government sector, which effectively gets paid by the government to give money back to the government and don't really produce anything of value within our society other than bureaucracy and more rules and regulations. But we're going to have a dwindling population of people that actually contribute to the GDP of this province, where we have this ever expanding base of completely useless people that do not feel that they ever have to work because they're going to be taught from the age of 17 years onward that the government will just take care of them like they're babies for the rest of their lives, and they don't need to get off their ass and find a job because the Liberal government's going to give them $2,000 a month, right? Without any thought as to how any of this is going to be paid for. And then let me tell you about their other plan as to how they're going to pay for all of this foolishness. Everybody that owns a home. Dr. Vaudry was talking about that earlier. Well, try not paying your property taxes and find out whether you still really own your home. Well, the Liberals now are floating an idea, because keep in mind, there's almost $5 trillion of value locked up in the home equity of every Canadian homeowner. So the Liberals are now talking about bringing in an equity tax on home equity, so that every year all of us are going to be forced to have an appraisal done on our property, so that the Liberal government then can assess a tax on our home equity and literally steal money out of your home equity account so that they can pay for all of these foolish World Economic Forum generated programs that make absolutely no sense whatsoever, except for the destruction of Canada and the Canadian economy. So all of the billionaires that are members of the World Economic Forum Club can come in and scoop up all of Canada and Alberta's resources at pennies on the dollar. That's their plan for Alberta. So independence is not only something that we all should desire, should think is for the benefit of our children and our grandchildren and our families, but becoming independent from Canada is now a matter of urgency. Canada is literally planning the destruction of our culture, the destruction of our economy, the robbery of all of our savings and home equity, all under the guise of the World Economic Forum slogan that we're all going to own nothing and be happy.
All right, so this is where Jeff is talking about how the federal government is actually antagonistic towards Alberta. And not just Alberta, it's all of Canada, really, when you go start looking at it. I mean, many people see that the federal government is actually, attacking us, going and bringing forth UN agendas and destroying our country right before our very eyes. And this is valid. I mean, obviously, this is going on. And really what this is doing is it's kind of cattle shooting Alberta into a no-win situation where we essentially have to go ahead and declare independence in order to be able to survive what the federal government's doing. And so is all of this planned out? I mean, is this some big master chess game where, you problem, reaction, solution, where you create the problem, you attack Canadians and Alberta in particular, and then Alberta was to separate as a reaction, and then the solution is, amalgamation with the states or who knows what, and I say that because, I mean, there is this agenda by the UN to be able to have 10 economic regions. And that's been going on for a long time. And you have Trump, talking about annexing Greenland and Canada, and the North American Union. So, all right. So Jeff is going on here talking about how the universal basic income plan that they have. And so he says here that everyone will be given $2,000 a month, while dwindling numbers of us who still work for a living will pay real taxes. Okay, and that's true. That's the way it's, how's that going to be done? And I want to refer back to when Jeff was talking about tripling the amount of money that basically the taxpayers, as well as other developments as far as revenue sharing and whatnot, would be given, to the various different Indian bands. Now, one of the elements there that I think is part of it, but it's not being shared, and maybe that could be clarified. And this has to do with this issue of UNDRIP, in which in Article 26, it says that the Indigenous have the rights to the land, territories, and resources to which they've traditionally owned, occupied, or used. So, by saying that, this is their territory and whatnot, and they're sovereign, that would mean that basically that they are the owners of the land in a not direct way of saying it. That's how I would see it anyhow. Now, Jeff can clarify that. But if they actually are considered to be the owners of the land, that's how they will be able to do massive revenue generation, is by taxing the rest of us. So I see it as a strong irony here, or hypocrisy, really. If you were to go and say, well, okay, complaining about the federal government and the taxpayers are going to be paying for this universal basic income of $2,000 a month, while at the same time saying that we have to give the various different Indian bands, tripling what we're giving them now federally, so to alleviate their poverty. So you can't have it both ways. And then he says, where we have this ever-expanding base of completely useless people who do not feel they ever have to work because they are taught that the government will take care of them like they are babies for the rest of their lives, and that they don't need to ever get a job because the government will give them money. Well, that's exactly what you're planning on doing here with this tripling of revenue generation for these various different bands and people. So this is, come on, Jeff, you can't do it both ways. Another key point here, and he rightly says that he points out that it's the World Economic Forum's plan to bankrupt everyone and to buy everything up on pennies on the dollar. Now, what needs to be said or indicated here is that that the WEF is simply just another globalist arm. And the WEF actually has stated that they want to work in conjunction with the UN to achieve their 2030 agenda, right? And so when you talk about the WEF, you also have to include the UN, because they're essentially on the same side of things. They're both UN globalist entities. And Jeff has been very pro-UN in the past, probably still is. Maybe he could clarify that. But people need to ask him about this, because the WEF and the UN are basically working together. And when you see that it's the UN that has created UNDRIP, and that is going on all across Canada right now, where all of Canada is being claimed. And you see it kind of popping up now, with the Oilers hockey games. You see that they're making land claims there. Land claims, with the King, when he was here, he said that he's on unceded territory, essentially, not Canadian land, but Indian land. This is a huge thing that's coming from the top down. And you have to kind of question, why is it that this is coming into the Alberta Prosperity Project, where they actually before wanted to have UNDRIP as part of the new Alberta Constitution embedded in it. This is, a huge issue, and it kind of ties into even back into Wexit back in 2019. Why is it that this whole Indian issue was coming into a separationist movement in Alberta? And let's go ahead and take a look at Ambrose Ralph again, and what he had to say. This is the 2019, right after the federal election. It's the first time I ever heard such a land declaration in Alberta, actually. And notice what he has to say.
Than Ambrose Ralph.
So as you know, I am the man, the face, and the voice behind the Alberta to the Point social media platform and the Alberta to the Point Political Activist Foundation. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are here today on Treaty 6 land, and I'd like to thank the First Nations people for having us and hosting us here today. Thank you.
Okay, so what does he say here? He says that first that we're on Treaty 6 land. Now this is in Edmonton, southeast Edmonton, and there's no reserve there. So this is a con game that's going on by they're stating that these treaty areas are their land when it's not their land. They ceded that land within those territories for reserve land, 120 acres per person approximately. And so if it was on a reserve, he would be correct. But by, he's conflating this thing to be that, because it's treaty land, it's their land, and that's not the truth, right? And then he goes and says, we want to thank the First Nations people. So the First Nations is another UN globalist term because, I'm old school, right? And so back in my day, it was basically North American Indians or Indians, and it wasn't a derogatory term at all. It was just basically identifying a people group, and just like Europeans, Indians, whatever, right? And then it started to change later on. Then it became Aboriginal. In order to be, you had to be politically correct and say, well, it's Aboriginal now. You can't say Indian. They don't like that term. So, everyone's being pushed into that. And then it went into First Nations. And this whole First Nations thing is just a political con game because they were never nations. They were tribes, in a sense. They never declared a nationhood status of any kind. They didn't even claim the land. They just basically, lived off of it. And so, so he uses the term First Nations. So we want to thank them. We want to thank the First Nations for having and hosting us here today. They never hosted anything, right? And what it is this is where we're going. It's going to be that they're going to be claiming all the land, and these governments, federally and BC as well, and Vancouver, and also apparently it looks like Alberta as well, because you've got the APP, in line with all of this, and you got Danielle Smith and the UCP fully, wrapped up in UNDRIP as well. So this is highly problematic, and you got Dennis Moudry is tied in with Danielle Smith. So all of this you have to question, where is this all coming from? Because it's coming from the top down, and why is it it's coming into what seemingly would be like a grassroots movement with the APP, but yet here we have, that going on, what we've discussed, and also with Wexit, with Peter Downing. Why is it that this is being spoken of in a Western separationist movement? So anyhow, this is highly problematic and highly suspicious all the way across the board. And all of those who are involved with the APP, especially the influencers and whatnot, they need to be, listening very carefully of what's being said here and not have the wool pulled over their eyes, because this is going to be highly destructive for us if some of these things that are being spoken about are actually being implemented in New Alberta. So anyhow, I hope that people will see what's going on and start taking action and start correcting things before they get too developed. All right. Well, thank you. Okay, bye. Oops, one more thing I forgot to mention here. Okay, this is years ago now. Dennis Moudry was giving his presentation, and he talked about the necessity of going from a legal system to a justice system. We'll play the clip here.
We have so much work to do. But we've been thinking about this, and we think it's absolutely critical. It's not good enough just to have policies and governance for a new government. It's not good enough just to have bylaws that are robust, that hold people accountable. You really need to fix a number of things. And in that new constitution, for example, we can move away from what we currently have, which is a legal system, and actually have a justice system.
This is very UN globalist talk, and I think Dennis, you need to go ahead and make a video talking exactly what it is you're proposing here, going from a legal system to a justice system, because everything that I see about a justice system is UN globalist papal type talk. And what we'll do here at the end is I'm just going to have a bunch of different screenshots that I will post, and if you want to read them, just pause your computer or your device and you can read them. It's going to take too long if I just let them play out until the time that people would take to read them. So just go ahead and do that, and just it shows that we're this whole UN globalist World Economic Forum system is heading us towards a system of justice, and justice is where truth and reconciliation is heading towards, right? And if you end up having a situation where the APP is heading towards a justice-based system, you have to question, what are you talking about? And, why is it that you're even talking about it? The APP at this point, seemingly is, Dennis Moudry and Jeff Rath as being the head of it. But is there other powers behind it that people might want to go and look into? Because this is all top down, this kind of talk and these kind of different issues that we've just discussed. And we have to know what's up with everything. All right, so just wanted to add that in there.